Hi, everybody. Welcome to the live chat on the future of electronic manufacturing. I'm one of your hosts, Brian DeLuca, along with Nicoletta Mino, and we would like to thank our sponsors, TTI, RFMW, and Symmetry, for sponsoring this live chat. If you have any questions, you'll see there is a Q&A chat at the bottom of your screen. If you just mouse over your screen, that Q&A will come up. We will be taking questions during this live chat, so please feel free to ask questions there throughout the live chat. And now let me pass you guys on to Nicoletta Mino.
All right, guys. Thank you so much for joining us. And I just wanted to thank our panelists, Michael, Andy, Lisa, and Seth. Thank you so much for joining us today. We've had a chance to talk to you guys individually about some of these topics, and so it'll be a great time to talk to you guys together. And I really want to kick us off by taking a look at, obviously COVID-19 has had an impact on manufacturing. That's why we're here talking about this today. So, what impact specifically is COVID-19 having on manufacturing reshoring trends here in the US? And, Michael, I'd like to ask you to kick us off with that.
Yeah, big topic. Actually, I think one of the more interesting things about this point in time is that the whole reshoring thing, of course, predates COVID. In fact, was making a lot of headway before COVID came along. In many ways, COVID's actually slowed it down. But it has become a big topic. I don't know where I read this, but recently I saw that Wilbur Ross, the Secretary of Commerce, was saying that this was going to be a boon for reshoring. To be honest, I'm not sure I completely subscribe to that. I think there's some very strong things behind the reshoring trend. It has a lot to do with automation, building close to your customer, that kind of thing. But COVID is a natural disaster, much like the earthquake, I think it was in 2016, was in Japan. That was very disruptive to, in my particular world, which is electronics and electronic components. And like a natural disaster, I think the biggest impact is on supply chains. So when you're talking about reshoring, I think what you're talking about with respect to COVID is the need to bring stuff back to the US because of disruptions in supply chains in China and other places. And then the other thing about natural disasters is, they're finite, right? In fact, you could probably say that about all disasters. There is an end point and you start to work your way out of it. And as you work your way out of it, a lot of that energy and passion for rearranging your supply chains, rearranging your manufacturing strategies starts to disappear as things return back to normal. So, with respect to COVID, the last point that I would make, especially as it concerns reshoring, is, let's say that the US actually had managed to keep the virus out of our borders. And so things were chugging along, we were making stuff and all the rest of it. Economically, we'd still be in trouble because our trading partners are in trouble. So as our trading partners close down, we lose markets to sell the stuff that we make. And if we can't sell it, we don't want to make it, et cetera, et cetera. So would we be in as big a hole as we are now? Maybe not, but I also don't think it would be a lot shallower than we are in right now. So the COVID thing remains to be seen. Like everything with COVID, I think the prudent thing is to say, who knows? We'll have to see.
Well, to that point then, what types of components, or products or services, which ones are really best suited for the current and subsequent phases of nearshoring if this is how things go? Andy, what do you think?
Sure, and I think I look at this maybe a little different than Michael, but let me first start by saying that many companies all over the world, particularly in the United States and North America, are learning very painful lessons about their vulnerabilities, and they're not going to want to build their supply chains the way that they were. I think that they're going to want to have more autonomy, that if this were to happen again, whether it's another pandemic, another trade war, which we've been dealing with for a couple of years now, or something else, they're going to want the capacity to deal with what's in front of them. And as we see it at VCC, they can do that in a few ways. And what they will likely do first is to look to understand what the true cost is to manage a global supply chain, which looks far beyond the ex-works pricing and even landed costs that many businesses have been operating with for years and years. Mm-hmm. And so at VCC, what we're seeing with more and more of our customers is that total cost of ownership of products manufactured in North America has become highly competitive with regions in the world like Asia. You know, another option that we're seeing our customers choose is to build redundancy into their systems so that they may still be engaged in China or wherever, but they'll have the additional meaningful capacity in North America. And so similar to Michael, VCC is a designer and manufacturer of illuminated electronic components and human-to-machine interface. We've also got robust wire processing, wire harness, EMS for our customers that need it. And so what we're seeing is that those components in our industry, we're seeing strong demand shifting back to North America. So whether you call it phase 1, phase 2, although as Michael said, I think earlier phases happened long before coronavirus. But we in our industry are already seeing robust increases in inquiries from existing and potential customers who want to bring these types of components and products back to North America.
Lisa and Seth, have you seen some of those trends as well?
Well, I definitely have. With my manufacturing clients, I'm definitely seeing a rising interest. I just got off a call with several CEOs, and two different ones brought up this reshoring possibility. One is preparing for taking on additional volume because there's opportunities, and the other one has outsourced, and they were moving more of their volume from China to Vietnam, and that's still a good decision, but they're actually considering moving some portion of it back to North America just because of the lead times and the customer demands and the amount of disruption. So it gives them more flexibility. So I think it's for sure it's coming up in all the strategic conversations of the manufacturing clients I have, and each situation is different, but it's definitely on the table, and some sort of a hybrid approach at a minimum is being reviewed.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that, because I think you've got a unique challenge going on right here, and you know, as Michael kind of alluded to, and I'll say it, we live in a global economy now, and I think that what coronavirus has shown us is that regardless, our U.S.-based economy is dependent upon whether that's exports or imports, the global economy. And, you know, a couple things, and of course, our focus at our firm is risk management, helping companies identify, quantify, prioritize risks that are out there. And for decades now, we've helped companies that have offshored understand the risk of doing that and balance that out. And I think what we will see coming out of this is, I don't know that we'll see a lot of onshoring as much as we will see diversification of offshoring. I think we'll see that those things will move to multiple markets. I do think we'll see some pickup in onshoring, but again, the labor cost, the manufacturing costs, all of that associated with onshoring is going to go into effect. And as companies look at the bottom line and their overall EBITDA and realize the additional cost of bringing everything onshore or a majority of things onshore, in a global crisis, economic crisis that we're in right now, there's just not the funds to do it.
What about, what about medical products, pharmaceuticals? I know that Seth is one of the areas you talk about a lot. You know, is this one of the areas that we might see this shift as well? You know, what impact has that had? I know we talk a lot about electronics, but I think it's an important point to bring up.
And should we make a difference between also, medical and then medical electronics too? Because I think there may be a difference there also, right, in what happens, because pharmaceuticals much different than, electronics.
Yeah, you bring up a great point though, Nicolette, in that I see it more as almost a national security issue. Roughly 90% of APIs, these are the active pharmaceutical ingredients that go into our everyday drugs, our blood pressure medications, our antibiotics, and so on and so forth, are manufactured in China. And so what we're seeing is two things that are happening. One is China's economy went offline long before ours did. So there was already a shortage. And while the FDA is attempting to address this, it has shown a light that we have a problem here. If China wanted to collapse the United States, they could do it without firing a shot. They just shut off our access to our prescription drugs. And so this is one of those things that, barring one company, which is Pfizer, pharmaceutical companies by and large get their APIs from China. Pfizer is actually one of the only companies that has 3 facilities that can manufacture that here in the United States. And as such, they've actually done quite well throughout this pandemic. And that's just pharmaceuticals, right? You see this in PPE, 50% of which comes from Asia. I mean, this is the challenge that we have, and we need to address it from a federal perspective, from a governmental perspective, as much as we do from an economic one.
Oh, I mean, Michael, let me ask you a question. Don't manufacturing companies then need to bulletproof their supply chains, just as much as their production operations then?
Yeah, and that's nothing new either. So I refer to the earthquake in Japan, which was hugely disruptive for about 90 days to the electronic component supply chain, and was a real wake-up call. Because what we learned from that, what we're learning right now, and what we've learned through every one of these we've been through, is how centralized manufacturing has gotten, for a variety of reasons, which, by the way, are still perfectly valid, and ultimately so far have tended to kind of rule the day and keep people's decision making with respect to supply chains and where they manufacture unchanged. But what we saw in 2016, I read a stat that there were 260 natural disasters, impactful natural disasters, notable disasters that happened in that year, with a global hit to the economy of about $250 billion, which, by the way, one of the things that crossed my mind when I saw $250 billion is that seems pretty small relative to the numbers we're throwing around these days, right?
Yeah.
But at the time,
yeah.
that was really big news. So you would expect after something like that, a year like that, you would see significant changes in strategy and de-risking supply chains. And from my perspective, my industry, I didn't see a lot of that. So, here we are today, where, a lot of our resins that used in the industry are coming out of China. A lot of the fabs for the semiconductor components are in China. Now, the big news in terms of reshoring, which I think is really interesting, is that the federal government is in fact talking about stepping up and strategically supporting shifting some of that fab work back to the US. In fact, TSMC, which is a big Taiwanese merchant wafer manufacturer, has announced they're going to invest billions in the US putting fabs here. I think they've already got one in maybe Washington or something. So to Seth's point, there are very strategic reasons for doing this that transcend the economics of it. I think the economics of it, human nature, that kind of thing, still tend to favor what we've built. And I've actually had the opportunity to watch this get built, because my industry was actually one of the leading industries to outsource back in the 80s. We started sending molding machines and stamping presses, and first to Singapore and Taiwan. And then when those places started to get expensive from a labor standpoint and China opened up, we rushed into China. So, we've been behind this big move into China. And so consequently, a lot of the stuff that gets talked about reshoring a lot of that's in my world as well. But the supply chain thing, the risks in supply chains, nothing new. Honestly, I'm not sure how you ever solve it, in that natural disasters are global phenomena. You can't predict where they're going to happen, earthquakes and et cetera, et cetera. People make whole careers out of trying to quantify that and come up with a supply chain strategy. And oftentimes what you come up with is economically not feasible and is going to put you at a disadvantage from a cost standpoint. So this is tough stuff.
So, Michael, you also mentioned manufacturing, like, in the U.S., right? They're building fabs. Do you think you're also going to see it if, ones that are in the U.S.? Because, the United States, like some countries like China, are really relatively large countries. Do you think it would be diversified across the country also, or just be in a local a localized part of the country, like on the West Coast or the East Coast, or, in the Midwest or whatever? Do you think we'll diversify across the domestic U.S. also if people do diversify in the U.S.?
Yeah, that's tough because the U.S. in essence is kind of like 50 mini countries that are operating independently with their own incentives. One of the neat things about that is, from the perspective of somebody wanting to manufacture in the U.S., is states will compete with each other and provide lots of incentives. So I think there's great potential for diversity, but it's going to be kind of haphazard and somewhat the function of an auction.
Andy, I recall from one of our conversations, you guys have manufacturing facilities here and in Mexico, correct?
Correct.
I wanted to talk about Mexico because there were some folks who were asking some questions before the webinar about, what about Mexico and what role does that play? Because we're talking a lot about the US and that potential.
Yeah, so for VCC, so we've operated in Mexico for almost 30 years. We've had a lot of success. We've got a robust facility just across the border from Southern California and Northern Baja California, Mexico. And it's worked really well for us for a number of reasons. Going back some decades, Northern Mexico was really where there was a lot of television production. With that came many engineering universities and colleges. So for what we do in our manufacturing processes, we find that there's just a tremendous amount of skilled engineering, skilled operators. So from a growth standpoint, which we've been growing nicely, it's just been a great place for us to be. Going back to something that Michael was saying there, from VCC's perspective, and as we strategize our growth and look into ways that we can invest in our future growth, within the United States, what we observe is that there is a regional component to manufacturing. In our core component business, not so much. They're little things that you can ship anywhere at low cost. But for some of our customers, when we start getting up into more complex cable assemblies, PCB assemblies, a regional component does come into play there. And so for our business, we do look at specific regions within Mexico, obviously the United States, as ways to build out our foundation for what we want VCC to become.
Lisa, are you seeing any of this with your clients as well? Any talk of Mexico?
Yeah, many of my clients are in Mexico already, and they have facilities there. So certainly Mexico is closer, clearly, to the US, and there's a significant consumer base and business base. So they're definitely seeing that as, they're evaluating that option as well, and maybe doing both. Mexico it depends on what you're producing and where you are, but generally speaking, they're less prepared than the US is to handle like the COVID implications if it strikes them, but they're also very, it's definitely a good, viable opportunity, and many clients are thinking of expanding, especially with the new agreements, et cetera. So we know that we have partnership, and so there's a lot of pluses.
So what else are they thinking about, Lisa? I mean, what other things are you seeing?
As far as Mexico goes, you mean, or?
No, in general, just the manufacturers you're working with.
For trends. So they are looking at the changing customer and consumer behaviors. I mean, it depends on who they're supplying, but both. So what are the evolving customer buying behaviors? Because it is evolving during this crisis, and it's leading to opportunities. So if they can determine what their customers are doing and what's likely to continue or stay in effect, if you will. Of course, no one can predict the future, but you can get an idea of what is happening if you're staying on top of it. So they're looking at what are customers doing, and then where could they innovate, or what, how should they change their strategy, their manufacturing base, their supply chain? How would they change to be ahead of that curve, so that they are more proactive and innovative rather than waiting for things to happen and hoping for the best. So that's really one of the key trends I see.
So I have a question. We talked about Mexico. We talked about, Michael, you talked about, as the industry moves from, countries to countries, are there any areas that we see, with diversification that we see maybe a possibility for this? Are there other countries?
Yeah. Anybody?
Well, I'm hearing some positive things certainly about other Asian countries like Vietnam. I mean, they're very excited, if you will, about manufacturing for the U.S. So, I mean, they have, of course, no one has the infrastructure that China has, but people are looking at Vietnam, they're looking at India, they're looking at certainly, expanding in Mexico. Actually, Taiwan is coming up. So I think there's a lot of countries that folks are looking at.
We're seeing Vietnam and India picking up the pace quite a bit, but we were seeing that even before COVID. That's more trade related. But when it comes to low cost labor, if that's what you're chasing in our lifetime, kind of the last place we're going to have to go is Africa, right? And there's a lot of really interesting things happening in manufacturing in Africa as well, but it's being led more by new technology, which I think at some point we'll probably touch on. I think technology is the big equalizer and actually takes labor costs out of the equation for much of this.
Right.
Yeah, the one thing I'll add to that, because we've done some work in Africa too, and I've actually been over there myself, and the challenge that you continuously have, and I agree with Michael, it's kind of the last frontier of manufacturing, specifically around labor cost, is the volatility of government. And that's one thing that Asia has tended historically, at least to prove, is that the government can put their finger on whatever they need to control the market and the market share coming their way. Africa is an ongoing challenge because of that volatility. And I think until US-based companies looking to manufacture and outsource to Africa see some stability there, they may be a little more reluctant to make that change.
But Seth, we're talking about, we've been talking about the U.S. and I'm just thinking about, price, and as manufacturing comes back, what kind of impact is this going to have on things like, changes for employees and health insurance, and how is that going to impact labor costs and, everything? What is the impact then on price?
Yeah, I mean, listen, all politics aside, whether you subscribe to the idea or not, we have a trickle-based economic platform where all things flow through. And so if we brought U.S. manufacturing back to the U.S. rather, you've got a number of things that factor into that. One is healthcare, employee benefits, right? The government still requires under the Affordable Care Act that employers provide health insurance. Health insurance and healthcare costs continue to inflate at a rapid pace. And so the cost, interestingly enough, I think that as we've seen costs obviously be lower in Asia for the employee population, foundationally they've risen over the years. It's the ancillary costs, the benefit costs, right? The liability cost, all of those things. And so if we do see a significant onshoring of products, rest assured that we'll likely see an increase in the price to the consumer. Because of that flow through, at least until we get to the place where we're actually addressing healthcare costs, which it doesn't seem like we're going to get to anytime soon.
Right. Well, one of the attendees asked, how does the cost comparison of China compare today versus Vietnam and other Asian markets and Africa? I don't know if any of you want to throw that out there and answer that question.
We're seeing costs in China, and we've been seeing them for a while, continue to grow because labor's fluid. People are changing jobs more rapidly, which creates wage inflation. There is a lot of regulation in China. I built a fab in China as part of a startup in the late 90s. And at that time, I was getting degreed engineers to work on my lines for about $300 a month.
Mhm.
And it's escalated tremendously since then. So Vietnam is a much more attractive. India is much more attractive. I saw the same thing early on in Taiwan. If you remember, Taiwan was one of the first stops for the whole offshoring revolution. And as companies moved in, people had jobs, labor market got tight, wages went up, standards of living went up. They started watching Western TV and wanting to wear Levi's and drive fancy cars and all the rest of it. Before long, and I think it was about a 20-year cycle for Taiwan, the cost of doing business in Taiwan was very similar to what it was in the West. And I've seen that same thing happen in China at an even faster clip. And that's, I think, one of the very awesome things about all of this. There is a democracy here in that as we move into these countries that were once upon a time third world countries, we lift people out of poverty, they become consumers, et cetera, et cetera. So there's this virtuous cycle. So honestly, I think there's a lot of good that's come out of over the years out of offshoring, good for the world, good for the people, and even places like China. So I don't view it as a four-letter word personally.
Well, then, how much of a factor then is labor cost in decision making about where to manufacture something? Is when you compare it to something like, availability and automation, does it really weigh high up there?
So yeah, less than less. I read something in, I guess it was Industry Week. It was a survey in Industry Week that of the things that manufacturing executives are worried about, 1, 2, and 3 is flexibility, quality, and transportation costs. Labor is actually further down on the list. And part of what's going on here is automation is getting cheaper. Robotics in particular, the cost decline of to employ robotics in manufacturing has dropped at an inverse rate to what the labor costs are. So now, I don't know where I got this from. Maybe if you're familiar with the Adidas Speed Factory phenomena, Adidas in the mid 90s shifted a lot of their production. It was all in Germany, and they shifted it out of Germany to Asia, and it bounced around in Asia, and I think it finally landed in Vietnam. And using a combination of robotics and 3D printing, they created these little small modular speed factories, and they were starting to bring production back out of Asia, because what they found is a speed factory employing 160 people could have the same output as a factory in Vietnam employing like 3,000 people. And you got a lot of advantages from it, in that you could do just in time. You could actually make shoes to a customer's order, and in the process of doing that, do something called mass customization, where you're using mass production techniques to make customized one-offs. So you could, for instance, have a customer scan their foot, and you could make a shoe out of materials and colors that perfectly fit their foot very quickly. So there was some market advantages of doing this as well. But labor wasn't a factor in any of it. And one of the other things that jumps out at me about all of this when we're talking about automation, so two things really. Here's another interesting stat. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, now this is a little bit dated, more than 80% of the manufacturing jobs in the US that have been lost in the last 20 years were lost to automation, not to low-cost labor, not to offshoring. And that trend is only accelerating. And one of the things that I think is really interesting about it is, if you look at the countries investing in robotics and automation and manufacturing, number one with a bullet is China. So even China, which originally got us all into the country because of ready and low cost availability of labor, recognizes that that is not a sustainable differentiator and has been investing heavily. In fact, I think more than half the world's industrial robots now live and work in China. So I think that's there's some lessons to be learned from that.
You know, are there any other variables? Andy, I think we were talking about, things like trade risks and that weigh in when we talk about labor.
Yeah, and Michael just mentioned a few others, right? But they're obviously lead time, responsiveness to changing customer demands, higher product quality and consistency. We've talked about labor. Those are all things that that we're, even in our business and our sourcing of components, those are the things that we're looking at in order to give ourselves more flexibility.
Yeah, one of the things, and I'll say this as it relates to labor, and I agree with what Michael and Andy have both said, I think labor has fallen down on the list of the things that we've seen as the primary driver. Quality, again, efficiency, effectiveness of the goods, those things are big. But the other thing is labor still is up there, but not in the way that we oftentimes would think about it. Labor has still remained on the list in large part, not because of the cost, rather the quality of finding talent labor here in the US to fill the jobs. I mean, as we look at the history of sustainability of employees in the United States over the past 2 decades, our parents and grandparents wouldn't fathom the amount of job changes that we see today, the cost of retraining somebody, the cost of managing that. You don't see that as much in many of these countries. And so their ability to efficiently, when need to, change out that labor and find a replacement. There's not big recruiting firms. There's not all of the overhead costs associated with that. So that still does play a role.
Another thing that we've talked about, we touched on it briefly with Michael, but Lisa, what about technology as we're talking about the future and we're talking about, potentially a lot of manufacturing coming back here? Technology has been a big factor. Is it still important then when we look into the future? Is it still an important factor?
Oh, absolutely. We've been a little distracted, if you will, by COVID, but what I'm seeing is the smartest manufacturers are continuing with their technology roadmap in the sense of, I've never believed in just investing in technology for the sake of having it, but as it supports your future direction. So, as folks have brought up, certainly robotics, it helps us to produce it more efficiently, but I'm also seeing artificial intelligence and a lot of the applications that can, improve upon even our customer experiences as well as our efficiency and profitability. IoT is, certainly coming up in the manufacturing environment. And actually something as simple as further leveraging our ERP systems and looking at, what other related software we might need to support our customers and growth, as well as, a win-win in terms of sales growth, more profitability, and more cash flow. So I think technology in general needs to remain at the table as one of those items that we need to be considering for the future.
And on the topic of technology, one of the attendees would like for us to maybe talk a little bit about edge computing and the role it might play in manufacturing going forward. I don't know if anybody wants to address that.
So edge computing, what we're talking about is Industry 4.0, which is, there's a lot in the press about that. And what we're really talking about when we're talking about Industry 4.0 is the next level of communication and data flow in the factory environment. Because today, and when you talk about supply chains, they're still very disconnected. Data isn't flowing seamlessly and transparently up and down the supply chain. And therein lies the source of a lot of day-to-day disruption that happens in supply chains. So that, the factory of the future, which actually is not so much the future anymore. I think there's lots of examples that are here today are using things like edge computing so that decision making can be done very close to the source. They're filling up with sensors. Those sensors are generating a tremendous amount of data. It doesn't necessarily need to be passed to the cloud for a decision. That can be done locally at the edge. You have things like Wi-Fi 6 being deployed inside of factories to speed up the communication. So everything's becoming more and more interconnected. And therein lies, my feeling is the biggest opportunity for productivity gains. And productivity gains that's the holy grail of not just manufacturing, of everything. It's doing more with less, making more on less. And we have a long way to go in terms of streamlining the information flow, which is going to help us de-risk supply chains. It's going to help us increase our quality. It's going to help us with our labor shortages. Sorry about that. I don't know how to turn that off. So anyway.
So I have a question, right? With edge computing combined with some of, we talked about robotics, we talked about IoT, Michael, right? Do you think that's really where it's going to help with the supply chain? It's going to help with the manufacturing, like when you combine all those things together in sort of one system, that's really going to be a lot where the efficiency is going to be, whether it's a labor shortage or it's a supply chain issue. If we have robots combined with edge computing, combined with AI, right? When you put all those pieces together, is that really where we're going fully to fix some of the problem that we may have or may not have?
I think so. I think it's necessary. It's inevitable. The technology is here today. And COVID and the trade war have been a bit of a disruption, but they've also, in many ways, been a catalyst to, I think we're going to see an acceleration of a lot of this.
So what do we, and I want to think about, what about things like we talked about edge computing and we talked about, AI and stuff, but what about additive manufacturing? Will that also impact the efficiencies then? Is that a key player?
I think absolutely so. Michael talked about Adidas and what they were doing, but additive manufacturing just enables us to be closer to our customers, do it, customized, which is definitely gaining in popularity, and do it efficiently. So I think it's absolutely one of those key technologies.
Yeah, I would add to that as VCC is a low to medium volume, high mix manufacturer. And so as fast as we can go, additive processes are really helping us to respond in custom applications or short run type applications where the customer needs something fast, not just prototyping, but full production.
All right, so we're talking pop-up cities. We don't know where they're going to be, but with robots and automation and additive manufacturing.
Well, additive manufacturing is super efficient. Throughout our history, it's been subtractive. You want to make a baseball bat, you start with a tree and you whittle it down. Lots of ways. Additive manufacturing is very natural. It's a biological manufacturing process. You start with the basic components, and it's very efficient, very flexible, and ultimately I think it's going to prove to be very scalable, and that'll be a major change in the way things are done, and it'll be a major change in the way where things are made too, because it's now all of a sudden your supply chain is going to be raw materials, and the closer you are to your raw materials, the better off you're going to be.
So let's say we do start seeing all of this shift. I have a question for you, Seth. What impact then on markets? If we look at the markets now, what impact could this have, for the country?
Well, I think it could have a significant impact, but again, all things flow to the bottom dollar, right? So you've got to look at what's that going to do. Whether that's onshoring, whether that's reshoring in other places. again, it's all going to flow through. That impacts tax revenues, that impacts trade deals from a political perspective. I mean, we've just gone through and are really still going through a significant trade deal with China that we've spent a lot of both physical and political capital on. So I think that, and that's why I think that you won't see anything happen swiftly. I think it will be a measured response. I think that as things happen, it will be on a company basis. But it's interesting as we talk to companies all the time, many of them do what we do around climate change, right? That's a great idea. Let's wait for the other guy to do it. And I think that you may see a lot of that there. And as a matter of fact, I think Andy, Lisa, and Michael have all mentioned, it is easy to go back to what you know. It is easy to go back to the familiarity of that. And so as we kind of come out of this, it'll be interesting to see which companies kind of heed the warning and at what level. But regardless, I don't think you see massive shifts.
So let me ask, is there anything else that you think, all of our wonderful panelists, is there anything else that you think is really critical for us to be thinking about when it comes to this topic of the future of manufacturing? You know, what should we all be thinking about right now?
Well, I think that we should be thinking about creating an innovation type culture, because there's no telling what's going to be completely in our future. So if we can get our our employees and even our customers and suppliers and create more of an ability to be thinking about as requirements change, as new ideas pop up, if we're able to leverage those and take advantage of these ideas, I think that that's really going to be important in the future here. And I think, I can't remember who, but somebody mentioned the agility and flexibility. That's going to be ever more important in the future.
Mm-hmm. One of the participants asked, really, they're asking about what the difference is between a very large company and using technology and automation in manufacturing versus small to mid-sized businesses. How do you guys think it's going to look for, the small to mid-sized companies?
I'll take a stab at that one. As a small, an SME, if you will, small medium enterprise, what's been exciting for us at VCC is that whether it's Industry 4.0, whether it's additive manufacturing equipment, other capital equipment, costs have been coming down. And so what that does is it allows a smaller business to compete more aggressively with typically much larger businesses who've had larger CapEx budgets over the years. So we find it to be, as part of our culture and as our strategy, is to really push and innovate as fast and as often as possible, because we understand that we have an agility as a smaller business that lets us capitalize on opportunity that way.
Yeah, I actually think small, medium-sized companies perhaps have an advantage in that they don't have these mass bases of equipment, capital that they're depreciating, that they've got to worry about. A lot of times you don't decommission that stuff because you still have, it's still on your balance sheet. You still have to pay for it. So it tends to slow you down. I think there's a lot more agility in smaller companies in terms of taking advantage of some of the new technology. And to Andy's point, the costs have come down, that it's not cost prohibitive to do some of this stuff. And what you don't want to do yourself, there are, so 3D printing, for instance, there's 3D printing outsourcing places you can go that right here in the US that are, quite capable and very reasonable. So I think the future of manufacturing is super exciting. We call it Industry 4.0, but it's a much bigger concept, and it looks completely different than what we've done traditionally. And whether it's manufacturing electronics, pharmaceuticals, or food, we haven't even touched on the agriculture piece of this. It's technology is making, it's a game changer in almost all of these areas.
Yeah, I'm seeing the same. That the small, medium-sized companies are becoming such a thorn in the side of some of the larger companies that they're trying to buy them or do something about it because they're so much more agile, and they don't even have to buy the technology, although it is coming down in price a lot, like as Michael and Andy have been saying. But you can partner, and I'm seeing a lot more creative partnerships, even with competitors. So I think a lot of, everything's on the table in essence to see how it is that you can create a win-win these days.
So we have another question from the audience. There are many companies attempting to streamline design to manufacturing activities and solve for inefficiencies in what can be a stratified series of events. What companies are innovating or leading the way in connecting design, supply chain, manufacturing?
In my world, I see lots of examples of this. And so the one I'll pick, I think perhaps best addresses the question, is in the contract manufacturing sector. A lot of the manufacturing of electronics, whether it's a telephone or a computer or whatever it might be, whatever the device is, gets done by a third party, a contract manufacturer. And these contract manufacturers, by the way, there's some really big ones that are global and will move manufacturing around the world based on what's happening, that kind of thing. But I see a lot of innovation happening there. They don't necessarily design product, but they work with their end customers to optimize design. So, this whole concept of design for manufacturing, again, not something new, but a tremendous opportunity still for improvements in not only cost, but speed to market, that kind of thing. So the more virtual and integrated the information and data from concept through component selection, through product design, through packaging, through where you're going to make it, how you're going to distribute it, etc., the better. And I think there's a lot of opportunity there, and a lot of innovation. And a lot of the innovation is coming from the software guys. And the new thing right now is as a service. So if you're going to start a company today, figure out how to work the AAS into whatever it is you're doing. Food as a service, kitchen as a service, clothing as a service. Pick it. If you want to attract investment, make it as a service thing. But in that is a ton of innovation along the lines of the question that you received.
Would anybody else like to take a stab while it's still on the table? Any other companies doing big things?
I guess I would add that Michael pointed out that there's some very large contract manufacturers out there, and there are also in the SME category, there are a number of, I'll say us, who similarly have developed adding the as a service. Michael, we're providing a service, maybe not to the Apple computers of the world, but certainly to a lot of larger companies, smaller companies as well, offering the design all the way through to manufacturing service quite successfully, and having a lot of fun doing it.
One of the things that I'm also seeing a lot of is this kind of module concept, where you take the sub-functionality of a system and you do it as a module basis, system as a module, or especially when it comes to IoT, and you snap these things together to create your end product, and the differentiator is the firmware and the software. But that's also pretty interesting, and it again lowers the cost for new companies to come in. I've run into 18-year-olds who have had an idea about something and were able to generate a proof of concept, go get a little money, and have something manufactured that was sellable very quickly, that you look at it and you think, wow, you can think of 10 companies that should be scared of this kid, right? So that's that whole side of the world is pretty interesting.
So I want to backtrack just a moment before I know we have 10 minutes left. Before we wrap up with one question from the audience, another attendee had asked, how does the cost of manufacturing in North America, such as Mexico, compare to that of China? So it appears we're focusing on Asia and Africa, but there wasn't a lot of talk about Mexico. So they asked if we could kind of do a little comparison there. What does that look like compared to, when you look at China versus Mexico in terms of manufacturing?
Well, I guess as a manufacturer with an operation in Mexico, I'll jump on that. I would argue from VCC's perspective, it's highly competitive. Mexico's highly competitive with China. Whether you call it, earlier we were talking about what are the capabilities of the supply chains within country for injection mold tooling, for example, metal stamping tooling. I mean, Mexico has been manufacturing very robust as it relates to the automotive industry, electronics. So from our perspective, Mexico stacks up. I mean, we go toe to toe with China frequently and are enjoying some success. So we think that it's a great place to be. And the fact that it's, from where I sit, if I wanted to leave my office here and be at our factory, it would take me just a little over 60 minutes. So we think that there's a lot of advantages for our customers and other companies in North America to collaborate and work with manufacturers in Mexico.
Well, and I would add to that I recently held a webinar with a expert from Mexico, and they had said that the direct labor cost per hour on average is $372. So it's not, it's quite competitive. And then, they were assuming in another example that direct labor is $340 an hour and indirect is $15. So, there's, in essence, labor is a diminishing piece of the equation, but as Andy brought up, there's some other advantages too in terms of proximity, et cetera. So I find it, it's quite competitive.
So I would like to end with this last question from the audience, and I would like to see if all of you would like to contribute in terms of business outlook for the next 3 to 6 months in whatever business you'd like to address.
Yeah, I'll start. I'll jump on it first. I think that, again, it really is going to be specific to the industry, to the company itself, their access to capital, how greatly they were impacted by supply chain disruption. I think that you're in that unique situation, I think, where every company is going to take a different approach based on their own parameters. I mean, from a positive perspective, capital is very cheap right now. So if there ever was a time to make investment, the dollars to get are coming in at a very low cost. And so I think from that perspective, that's positive. The only other thing I will say that before I kind of pass along to the other panelists is, and I think Michael mentioned it on the onset, this isn't like what we saw in 2008. This isn't like what we saw in the Great Depression or even the bubble burst of the 80s. This is a healthcare pandemic that has in effect shut the world down. This isn't an isolated to the United States or China or anywhere else. And so I think we're all in a little bit of a wait and see, but I'm optimistic that specifically here in the US, as strong as our economy was going into this, it's a timing game, but if we can come out of it quick enough, we will get back as quickly as possible under the circumstances.
Yeah, I think so too. But key to this is the health of our trading partners. We all have to get well at relatively the same pace. Now, country to country, that's not likely to happen. But industry to industry, I think there is better connectivity, and depending upon the industry you're in, I think you are going to not get back to normal, because I do believe that the definition of normal, regardless of what you're looking at, is going to change. But to get clearly on the other side of this, get back in a very strong recovery mode. It is going to be different industry to industry. I think the global electronics industry, honestly, I think Q4 is going to be an up quarter for the global electronics industry. We'll see, I believe, good signs of that in Q3. I mean, even in the worst of this in electronics, there's actually been some companies that have benefited tremendously as a result of this because of the technology that they bring. So, but that's where the U-shaped recovery that's starting to get talked a lot about comes from. At a macro level, it looks like as you get close, what you're going to see is lots of little spikes as one industry starts to get its legs again and others don't. But the overall trend is going to be this, coming out of it. And as Seth said, I'm really find lots of reasons to be bullish for this decade, and largely because of technology. And I think once we're on top of this virus, I personally think we're going to pick up the pace globally, as long as we continue to work with each other, as long as we get some of our trade indifferences and other things worked out, as long as we don't become too isolationist. I think the next 10 years are going to be amazing.
Yeah, I think I think the same, that there's vast potential for growth coming out of this. It very much depends on the industry, very much. So I already have manufacturing clients that are seeing significant volume increases, but it depends on what they're producing and who their customers are. So I think that's why I go back to the changing and evolving customer expectations. I think there's a big opportunity for companies that can evolve, and the U.S. is quite innovative in the general sense. So I think we are well positioned from many perspectives, including our consumer demand and our business demand. And then there is going to be some sort of reshoring going on. So we have a lot of positive energy going, and I think to Michael's point, we have to be aware that we can't just move things around if we haven't considered our full supply chain, and we have to make sure that we are thinking through this well. But we're very positioned for strong growth in the future.
That's great.
Yeah, echoing what the rest of the group is saying, in the immediate term, I guess the 3-month term, our focus is really staying close with customers, making sure that their needs are met. Some industries aren't doing so well, and so we consider ourselves a partner, and so we'll be there for them during that challenge. And more intermediate to long term, 6-month and longer, I'll tell you that at VCC 2020 was and will be the largest CapEx investment year that we've had as a company, largely because of demand that we've got with existing customers, as well as the anticipation of the things that we've been talking about here. So we're very optimistic, even here in the tail end of 2020, with what we're going to see globally, but certainly here within North America.
Well, thank all of you. We'd like to thank you, the amazing panelists, our audience.
Thank you for leaving us on that really optimistic message.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
And we'd like to thank our sponsors too, TTI, RFMW, and Symmetry. Thank everyone. I hope everyone enjoyed this discussion.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.